I thought I would give sort of very different kind of a speech, focus a little bit more on some broad themes, what's going on in the world, how to think about investing, how I'm thinking about some of the things that I see out there. And I think one of the things one should always try to do as an investor is ask the questions that people are not asking. And I think there are sort of all sorts of questions that get asked a great deal, and they are, they tend to be sort of cover ground that is well trodden, and you can sometimes, I think, learn more by asking the questions a little bit better and pushing the envelope a little bit further. But I tend to think that often the most promising things to do are to ask some questions in areas people aren't even thinking about. And I want to suggest one such question today, which is sort of if you think about the world, we have sort of a developed world and we have an emerging markets world. And with respect to emerging markets, people typically ask the question, where will this country be in 20 years? So where will China be? Where will Brazil be? India, Russia maybe, other EM countries. And you generally have a pretty bullish story because they're going to grow a lot more in the next 20 years, and there'll be a lot of development, and there'll be some ups and downs, but you tend to end up with a story that's very positive by focusing on a very long time horizon. With respect to the developed world, U.S., Western Europe, places like that, we tend to ask a question about what's going to happen in the next 6 months. Is the system going to go bankrupt? Is it going to survive? Is the recession going to be a V or a W or a U or an X, whatever letter you like to have? And I think there's something very strange about the fact if you juxtapose these two types of questions, and I want to at least suggest that they point to a question that we're not asking very much, which is, where's the developed world going to be in 20 years? And I want to spend some time thinking about that question today. Now, I think the basic sort of set of outlines would be, well, you could one answer is the developed world's going to be vastly better off. People will see tremendous income growth, tremendous increases in prosperity, and then there were sort of lesser versions of that, and there are versions that are where things are borderline stagnant for a long period of time. And I think the question that drives whether things are going to be better off or not is fundamentally a question not about leverage or repairing the financial system or about globalization or trade, even though those are good things and probably will help some at the margins. I think the question of whether we'll be better off in 20 years or not basically gets decided by what's happening in science and technology. And if science and technology progress a lot, we'll be a lot better off in 20 years. If they don't, we won't. And sort of all these sort of questions about, is the Fed printing too much money? Do we have runaway inflation? Is the dollar going to collapse? If we have enough growth in science, technology, enough productivity growth, everything will be fine. If we don't, we won't. And so I think the question about where the developed world is going to be in the next 20 years comes down to the question of what's happening in science and technology. And I want to sort of offer, this is sort of my somewhat pessimistic view on things, is that these areas are significantly more broken than people realize. They're not hopelessly broken, but things are not in great shape. And if I sort of had to identify a place where I think there's a real crisis in our society, it is that there's not actually enough innovation happening. Now, as a parenthetical thing, it's extremely hard to figure out what actually is going on. It's something of a black box. But one thing we could say is that all the people who know are incredibly biased. So if you're a university professor working on studying ants in the Amazon, you'll be writing grant applications and saying this is actually critical for developing a breakthrough drug on cancer. You're not going to say this is a silly project where I just want to get some money to study ants in the Amazon. And if you're running a startup company, you will tend to say this is the greatest company in the world. You won't say it's sort of a hit or miss thing, and probably it'll miss. And if you're a venture capitalist, you'll also tend to be quite bullish about all these great opportunities. And so we have this sort of weird dynamic where sitting in New York or in London or in any of these, or DC, people generally don't really think about this question a lot. They don't have a strong view. The people we listen to, however, are uniformly quite bullish and skewed in quite a bullish direction. And it seems to me this is something we should be questioning a lot more than we are. And sort of some of the data points that, in my mind, suggest that not all is as well as it should be, center with facts like venture capital firms have basically made no money for 11 years. They're still in a zone where it doesn't look like there are going to be that many IPOs. And even though I think Sarbanes-Oxley deserves a lot of the blame for that, I don't think it's really the sole culprit. And I think there's sort of a somewhat deeper story of something being weirdly off. If we were to say that science and technology are the future of the U.S., and you say, well, it's located in Silicon Valley, sort of the naive prediction you'd make is, not knowing anything else about the U.S., is that the single best state in the U.S. to be in at this point is the state of California. And that's obviously not quite the case. And then you ask, why is that? But if there's all this great progress happening, and it's about 2 or 3 districts, congressional districts, are in Silicon Valley. The other 50 or so are, it's government workers and farmers and people building houses, and there's a really big disconnect between the image and the reality, and sort of it's a much smaller part of the state than people think it is. And if it's not enough to actually drive things in California, is it really enough to drive things in the U.S. and the world as a whole? And then I think you have sort of macroeconomic things like we have this very odd juxtaposition where people on the one hand believe you have exponential technological growth, and the other you have this weird fact that median wages in the U.S. have been stagnant for about 36 years. And there's been maybe a small increase in wealth inequality. I don't think that's the real explanation. And I think that, and you sort of end up with one of 3 explanations. One is that, the first one is that, there's all this progress, it just takes a while to filter through. But it seems like 36 years is an awfully long time. Second explanation is, we're not measuring the progress correctly. The problem with that one is that a lot of it turns on whether you believe the government is understating or overstating the rate of inflation. And the normal view is the government actually is understating the inflation rate. And if that's the case, then it's actually then the progress rate is actually being exaggerated even more. So if you assume the government's just right, then we're sort of stagnant. If you assume the government's overstating, sort of understating inflation, it's actually even worse than it looks. And then the third one is just that somehow, even though there has been innovation in many areas, it's not been enough to offset declining productivity elsewhere, demographic transition, all sorts of other challenges and headwinds that we're running into as a society. And I think sort of one way to sort of capture the contrast culturally is to think about where people in the late 1960s thought the world would be today. And if you look at the future history of Star Trek, 1967, it would be permanent lunar bases by 1980, missions to Mars by 1990, and it would sort of go on to the stars from there. The Jetsons, you'd have flying cars and robots, and on vacation trips to the moon. Sort of a somewhat more conventionally, writer wrote a best-selling book in 1968. This French writer Zerban Schreiber wrote a book entitled The American Challenge, sort of talking about where the world would be in the year 2000. And the basic theme was that the United States was this technological civilization. It was accelerating. And because of that, the difference between the U.S. and the rest of the world was going to steadily grow. And the difference between the U.S. and Europe would grow from a difference of degree into a difference of kind, so that by 2000 it would be like the difference between Europe and Nigeria. It would be they'd be left completely in the dust. And this would have all sorts of sort of strange cultural repercussions, and one that that I think is striking in terms of how wrong the prediction was that setting aside executives and creative people who sort of like their jobs, most people don't really like their jobs, and the average person would benefit because of all this increased productivity. They wouldn't have to work as hard. And so by the year 2000, the average person in the U.S. would be working 7 hours a day, 4 days a week, and would have 13 weeks a year of paid vacation time. And this would all happen within a single generation. Now, it's sort of easily dismissed as, well, he was a French writer, he didn't know what he was talking about. But I think that there's sort of a degree to which we should ask some very tough questions about why there's been such an incredible disconnect and why things haven't quite caught up.